Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 174. What can you learn from feeding an entire book on Python programming into ChatGPT 4 and asking it to provide a technical review? What are the potential pitfalls of using an LLM as a learning tool? This week on the show, author Al Sweigart talks about his recent experiments using ChatGPT and Python. Al wanted to test how well an LLM could understand the computer science concepts covered in his recent book, The Recursive Book of Recursion. We talk about the positive and negative results of this technical review. We consider if this would be a valuable tool for technical review of your projects. Al shares his thoughts on using ChatGPT as a learning tool and its potential pitfalls. We also cover the current strengths of this type of tool for Python developers. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Al, welcome back.
Hello, it's good to be back.
Yeah, it's fun to talk to you again. I've been looking forward to it. We've kind of been playing back and forth with this topic, I think, for, 4 or 5 months. So I'm excited to get you on the show. And every month, there's always something kind of new to discuss in it. It sounds like you've been playing around a lot with ChatGPT and some of these other large language models and trying to figure out maybe, is part of it, are you trying to figure out where it fits into like your workflow or like maybe how you might want to use it?
That and also just finding out about it in general. At first, I was sort of really dismissive about it because it's sort of like, oh, yeah, AI. That's every 10 years or so, AI becomes like a hot thing again.
Yeah.
And it was hard to see how this more recent AI, which is really large language models, is that any different from all the general machine learning stuff. And of course, people were talking about ChatGPT. And I thought, like, okay, yeah, I've been around. I know how the hype cycle works, but I was talking with Eric Maths, the author of Python Crash Course at PyCon this year. And he was really starting to take a look at it. And he told me to go ahead and check it out. And so, since about April, I've been looking at ChatGPT and the other large language models as ways of generating code, as ways of checking for bugs, and also just for catching mistakes in my programming books as well.
Cool. Yeah, it sounds like a whole bunch of different things we can kind of touch on. And those are definitely things I think that'll be of interest for the audience. I have been playing with, I have an OpenAI account, and so I've been messing with it here and there. I haven't been using it as much for coding. I kind of maybe over the last couple of weeks been doing a little more of that. I have been using it for other interesting uses, and Real Python's had a whole bunch of different articles approaching a lot of these tools. One was from Martin Broyce. He tackled it from the personal coding mentor kind of idea, like how it could help, say, somebody's more in their beginning stages of Python learning. How could ChatGPT be there? And I think that might be one of the angles that you have looked at a little bit also.
Mm-hmm.
He did a whole thing on about prompting, which I think is fascinating. And I definitely want to talk a little bit about that. The more specific you can be, it seems to be the most helpful. The machine still likes instructions. So
yeah, because I mean, this applies, I guess, to both AI and people, but nobody can really read your mind.
Yeah. Reasoning is not its strong suit, I think, is maybe where some of it falls down, like it trying to figure out things. Yeah. One of the things that you did, and I'm not sure when this was, I guess it was in June. You had ChatGPT 4 do a review of your recursion book. Like, do you want to talk about that project and what you were hoping to get out of having a look through your recursion book and some of the results?
Right. So this is for my book, The Recursive Book of Recursion, which covers a whole bunch of recursive algorithms. And I always thought, like, why is this so hard for a lot of people? So I thought, well, I can break down all all the pain points and how it's taught poorly and figure it out and then write a book. And I thought I could just sort of squeeze this book out pretty quickly, and then it ended up taking about 5 years. But
Yeah.
it came out. It's all of my books are freely available under a Creative Commons license on my website, inventwithpython.com. And I took this book and I said, okay, well, it's been published through No Such Press. It's had editors go through it. It's been through technical review. I keep going over and over it. And so it's out now. It's published. And I thought, well, what if I just copied and pasted the entire text of the book and fed it into ChatGPT 4 with the prompt of, this is a book on programming, find any conceptual errors on it. And I wasn't interested in spelling mistakes or typos or grammar mistakes or that sort of things, but are there mistakes with like bugs in the code, or did the book get its facts wrong? And I was actually surprised that there were some things that it found, but oh boy, yeah, it was it was a slog. I mean, the one thing is I had just gotten my OpenAI account, and I hadn't learned how to use the API yet. So I was just copying and pasting it in. I think about roughly I figured I could get about 12,000 characters of text into it, and exporting it from the ebook version, it got rid of all of the indentation for a lot of the Python code, and that required a lot of cleanup and just other little things like that. But for the most part, I wrote up an entire blog post about it called Using ChatGPT 4 to Review My Recursion Programming Book. And breaking it down, I think I got about 180 something bits of feedback from it that I categorized. So about 61% of the feedback that it provided was stuff that was basically useless. I mean, or it would be kind of helpful, but not really helpful enough that I would want to, contact the publisher and say, hey, let's do a new printing of this sort of thing. It was just sort of, suggestions of, well, you can reword it like this. And I thought well, yeah, I could do that, but
sort of Grammarly kind of stuff that might be suggested. And you're like, this feels like it's not, written in a technical writer's methodology and, could be construed in a certain way or whatever. And
exactly.
Okay. Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I get all the time, and I have to say, no, I like phrasing it this way.
Same here. Grammarly helps out, but you have to do a lot of filtering yourself as well. And the same thing was here for ChatGPT. So that was 61% of the feedback that it gave me, but 15% of the feedback, so I think this comes to about a dozen and a half items. It actually did find things that I had gotten wrong.
Oh, okay.
Some of these were I think somewhere I said, as the aspect ratio increases, it becomes more taller than wider. And actually, I got that switched around. It gets wider than taller. So these were things that weren't spelling mistakes. They weren't grammar mistakes. They were actual, factual errors in the text.
That's interesting. That's something that a Grammarly wouldn't catch because it's not trained on those kinds of technical concepts or potentially programming concepts.
Right. And so it actually did kind of help me out right there. So that was 61%, which is sort of meh, and 15% where it was actual things that needed to be corrected. But then sort of the remaining 24% were so about a quarter of the feedback that it gave me were things that were just wrong.
Oof.
If I followed ChatGPT's advice, I would be introducing mistakes into the text. And some of these were little and some of these were pretty big. These were sort of black is white, up is down, left is right sort of mistakes where you just read this and I can say oh, that's not true.
Yeah.
So the main thing that I really wanted to highlight in this blog post, and in the blog post, I detail out every single one of these 180 sort of things. So you can read the preamble there, but and then dive into the details if you want.
Yeah, you even provided the whole GPT chat log.
Oh, yeah.
If people truly want to dig in.
Yeah. But the main thing that I came away from this is this is not going to replace anyone's job anytime soon. And really, but at the same time, though, that 15% of stuff that it found, that was actually pretty useful because this had already gone through like all the human review steps and then things that just everybody had missed. And so I thought like, okay, this is actually pretty useful. It took me about a day or two to just copy and paste the entire book and go through all of the feedback items. And this is kind of hair pulling because literally most of the time, the feedback that I'm getting is I know it's going to be wrong or it's not really going to be that helpful. Just to get those like little nuggets of utility from the feedback.
It's interesting because it's like a full technical review in a way. And it also had grammatical stuff, which that's interesting. But I could see somebody as a technical reviewer using it as like a Grammarly pass, kind of thing. Like, okay, it's flagged all these things, but unfortunately as a human being, I still have to check your work.
Yeah.
And, find all this stuff that it's decided one way or another. Did you have someone else suggest this to you? Like you heard somebody else trying this out as an idea, or did you just...
Oh, no.
Okay, it's your novel idea.
Yeah, I've gotten into like just throwing tons of different little things at ChatGPT
Okay.
and seeing how it works. I've noticed there is a noticeable improvement between ChatGPT 3.5 and 4.
Okay.
So I would definitely, unless it's a very minimal question, I would always stick with ChatGPT 4. Oh yeah.
Could you delineate why? Like what's changed? I mean, I know maybe it's a larger corpus that it's been trained on, and maybe it's fresher, newer, but what are the kinds of things that you see as differences?
I think I've noticed it mostly in whenever I ask it to generate code.
Okay.
3.5 still has a bad habit of producing code that is, maybe it's syntactically correct, but it'll just have bugs or it won't work, or it'll hallucinate APIs that don't actually exist.
Yeah.
I'll be looking up stuff like, oh, how do I scan this file? And it'll say, well, call the scan file function. And I thought like, yeah, that would be great if that function were real, but it's not.
We had an article recently, I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. It was actually about the linter rough, and this person had done you could tell they just basically fed it in there and said, hey, give me an article that talks about all the features of rough. And it had a whole middle section that was about how it could have a set of rules, and that you could actually define your own rules and how to create them, and had all these API points and so forth. And if you went and looked at the documentation, none of it was there.
Yeah.
Which is just kind of fascinating. And then I thought to myself, well, that's interesting in a way that, like, if it thinks that stuff is useful, and you are somebody creating an API, not that you don't already have a lot of other work on your hands, but it's like, yeah, maybe that would be kind of cool that it actually like give you suggestions. Like, this is something that maybe people would want. So, but
yeah, I thought you were going to say that like, oh, and right in the middle of it, it started talking about dogs and
rough. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge problem, is that it will just hallucinate APIs, which is actually one thing that I actually look at ChatGPT for doing, is because the API or the documentation for a lot of APIs is usually going to be pretty bad. I'll find some new software library or a new package, and I'll want to use it, and the documentation is very technical but not very helpful. And so I can ask ChatGPT like, hey, write a program that does this basic task using this Python package. And as long as the package was produced before, I think it's September of 2021,
okay,
is when the training data was collected, it'll generally be able to spit something out, and then I'll take a look at it and be like, oh yeah, this is pretty nice. Well, sometimes. And then other times it will produce buggy code that doesn't work. And then I'll point out like, hey, this program doesn't work. And then of course, I'm sure anyone who's used ChatGPT knows it'll then profusely apologize and then offer up something else, which will probably also be wrong.
The apology thing is interesting.
Yeah, that is something I can definitely tell that they've added it in, because I don't think it always did that.
Yeah, I have this is really a stupid tangent, but I think about this often in my own home when the voice assistant boom of, gosh, what is it, almost 10 years ago now, when all these devices arrived, and you say Alexa or Siri or call all these names. Sorry if I triggered anything out there. But I occasionally be like, okay, thanks, or whatever. I'd have like kind of a polite kind of thing or whatever. And I had other friends that were just mean
Oh,
all the time to their assistants. And I had no idea like why. They'd be like screaming, like, shut up and so forth. And like, just like, I wonder about that sometimes, about the relationship as these things have advanced. So
yeah, that's a total Rorschach test.
yeah, it tells you a lot about people. Like, or you see how like in some sci-fi, like how different devices, robots, and stuff are treated. These things.
Yeah, it's I used to be very polite to even like typing into ChatGPT or to
Sure.
the the voice activated assistants that shall not be named because I don't want to activate them with my voice.
Right.
But then after a while, I've like with ChatGPT, I just say, give me a program that does this instead of being more polite about it, because I sort of realize, there's no sense being polite with it or angry about it. These are very much tools. And
Yeah.
I've noticed that the decision to make them anthropomorphized,
Right.
like have ChatGPT answer your requests in a first person perspective, that is very much a marketing move to make people think that these are human intelligent level systems, when really you can find that no, large language models are not that. They are software tools that are very impressive in some aspects, but absolutely not impressive in others.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, anyone can do this. Just go to ChatGPT or Bard and give it two large numbers just to multiply, and then just say like, here's this 20-digit number multiplied by this other 20-digit number. ChatGPT will always get it wrong.
Do you think it just doesn't have that combination of numbers in it, or that
Yeah,
it's just
that's
like calculations is just not its thing?
yeah, because with mathematics, it's a very precise process, whereas these are text generating systems that are very stochastic and work off of a training set. Now, for like small numbers, it can, but there's, I don't know if you know this, but there's a lot of numbers out there. Just maybe infinite. Who knows?
Right.
But so it's not going to have like a table of every single possible multiplication pair between every pair of numbers.
Yeah, I think of like the cached items in it, or interned, or whatever they're called inside of Python, that are objects already, something like that.
Right. Yeah. Now, so, obviously, like we can say like, oh, well, okay, it doesn't get this right. I mean, it'll usually get the size of the product right, like the correct number of digits.
Oh, okay.
And also, interestingly, it'll get the first one or two digits on the left-hand side of the number. It'll often get those correct, but then the rest are just random noise, essentially.
Yeah.
So, I believe that probably, in our 5 or 10 years development, and I'm sure that AI will be able to multiply two numbers together.
Yeah, I would think it'd have like a separate like channel that it would be able to think in, like, okay, let me do calculations over here versus guessing the next word.
Oh, sure. But that's sort of the problem with large language models, is that it'd be really easy to do that and just say like, oh, this is a math problem. I'll feed it to this math subsystem.
Right.
But that's the problem with general artificial intelligence in general, is that there's too many possible tasks for it to do that. You can't just program it for everything.
Right.
And so that's why I really like using the term large language model, because that's very specifically what things like ChatGPT are. And that in artificial intelligence has meant so many things over the last several decades. It used to mean a computer that played chess. And then it meant like an Eliza chatbot that was
some
very
kind of video game enemy algorithm.
Right. And then you would play the AI in like Counter-Strike or Quake or these other video games.
Right.
And so now in the last few years, it now means like these also chatbot systems that can also answer questions about basically any topic. It's just that, the answer might not be true, but it does produce grammatically correct and recognizable responses that seem on topic. So ChatGPT is sort of like the guy who has read the Cliff Notes version of every book and read all the headlines, and they talk very confidently.
But they still confuse characters' names.
Yeah, exactly. And they just, it's an overconfidence problem, and you can clearly see that this is a product of Silicon Valley.
I think about some of the areas that we, definitely kind of leaning toward programming uses. You mentioned a couple things about I'll call them inaccuracies or confabulations or whatever. Are there other experiences you've had with like it not so much focusing on the language part of, say, your book or whatever, but like it generating code for you? Are there other experiences of inaccuracy outside of it, like saying, "Well, just use this API," and of course, in this particular case, it didn't exist. Were there other areas or specific areas where they occur more often?
So right now, I'm actually working on the third edition of Automate the Boring Stuff with Python.
All
And
right.
for the longest time, I put off talking about ChatGPT and these other AI systems because I thought like, oh, yeah, I don't really want to go into that. But then I realized, okay, this is something that's not going away anytime soon. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there. I mean, a lot of people, whenever they talk about AI, then they try to get the idea of like data from Star Trek
Right.
or something like that. Yeah. One rule of thumb I've developed is that if you're ever reading an article about AI and they mention some science fiction TV show or movie, that person really doesn't know what they're talking about when they're
Right.
talking about like LLMs or ChatGPT, because they're going off of what we want AI to be. And this has been the dream, going all the way back to like Fritz Lang's black and white movie Metropolis,
Sure.
just this artificial person that can do labor for us for free and they are as smart as a human being. Also, I realized that you can also kind of tell how old the person is based on what
The reference
sci-fi
points?
character. Yeah. So like I say data from Star Trek The Next Generations, but if somebody says Hal from 2001 A Space Odyssey, you can tell like, oh, they're probably older. Or if they mention Westworld, they're probably younger. um,
Yeah.
yeah. And again, AI is something, if you look up the Wikipedia article for AI winter, which is sort of the term for this period after the hype kind of deflates, you can find that there's an AI winter in the 1970s and an AI winter in the 1980s and 1990s.
Oh, interesting.
There's this constant, like, we really want to believe that one day we will get computers that can operate at the level of human intelligence. I remember these things called expert systems were really big, I think, back in the 80s and part of the 90s as well. And really, they were just sort of a giant flow chart of if else branching and some probabilities. And these things would replace doctors and lawyers because we could just take medicine and it's like, okay, what's your fever? Are you experiencing pain here? And the idea was like, if you just had a big enough table of if else statements, you could then come up with a medical diagnosis.
Right.
And it's easy to look back on that and laugh, but now we're looking at our current area of AI and people are talking about Skynet and all of these other things, and there's just so much hype and it's hard to deflate it. So going back to what you were talking about earlier, mistakes being made outside of programming, I had a very interesting conversation with ChatGPT. I hate talking like this. Like,
Sure.
no,
Yeah.
it's just a large language model. It's not a person. But anyway, yeah, I asked it what David Bowie's birthday was, and it told me January 8th, 1947, which is correct. But I started poking around and I said, well, hey, what's your source for this fact? And ChatGPT just replies, oh, this is widely known and documented. It's found in numerous biographies and articles
Okay.
and official records. And I was like, name one of these numerous biographies and articles and official records. And it said, oh, certainly. It's like, it brought up, what is it? David Bowie, A Life by Dylan Jones. And it says, yeah, in this biography, Bowie's birthday is given as January 8th, 1947, and it's confirmed there. And I said,
Huh.
okay, where in that book is David Bowie's birthday listed? And it said, like, well, like, it can't give you a specific page number because that would require access to the actual book. And then I said, well, list the chapters of that book. Like, has ChatGPT read this book, or
Right.
is ChatGPT just like that guy at the water cooler just kind of talking about this thing they heard about.
Yeah.
And again, the actual fact is correct. But I just kept poking at it. It's like, hey, how do you actually know what you claim to know? And eventually I did get ChatGPT just to say, yeah, I'm just inferring this based on the nature of biographies, and I can't guarantee that this specific fact appears in this specific book. And that's kind of worrying.
Yeah.
First of all, because I don't know if it actually is telling me the truth here, because maybe it does actually have that book in its training data and it could tell me, but it's been programmed not to tell me this, because that would reveal that now this copyrighted work of this biography has been used for the training data. And I know that is definitely the case, because earlier on, I remember asking it, because so many people say like, oh, Al, you've written Automate the Boring Stuff with Python. Have you tried like automating the process of book writing? And that joke gets more and more hilarious every time I hear it. But I thought like, hey, how can I automate a book on programming? And so I fed it some question about like automating the writing of a book on automating things.
Right.
And it proceeded to spit out verbatim the back cover of Automate the Boring Stuff with Python, except it got the title of the book slightly wrong. But I know from that, like, okay, clearly it has all of this wording in its database. And
you've been crawled.
Yeah, I don't know if OpenAI just got this from, some public database, or does it have has it scanned the entire book? I would assume that they would, the world's corpus of published books is so huge and rich information. Of course, I would want to have used that as a training set,
right?
Almost. But then, we're still very early on. So, all of these copyright and IP issues haven't been resolved yet. And we're still asking, especially with computer generated art now, we're saying like, hey, is this ethical? Because is it sort of like a person looking at a bunch of art and getting inspired and of course learning from that? Because we don't consider that to be infringement.
Right.
But then again, this isn't a person. This is a software system, and that's being fed all of this image data. And clearly it's impossible to find like the copyright issues for these millions of pieces of artwork and imagery that we're using for the training data. So, I would say like, yeah, maybe ChatGPT doesn't have this information like about David Bowie's birthday, and it knows exactly where it is, but it doesn't want to reveal that. Or maybe it actually doesn't know what it knows. And it just knows what the birthday is, but doesn't actually know where that bit of information is from. And so that's, it's kind of worrying. And also, but then again, well, we all have facts that we know, but we haven't actually looked it up. Like,
right. We wouldn't necessarily be able to tell you where we...
Like, I think I was like in college before I ever actually saw my own birth certificate. I was just sort of taking it as, yeah, my parents are probably telling me the truth about what my own birthday is. That's probably true. But, we all have information that we rely on as factual. And for the most part, it gets us through the day. I guess that's sort of branching more into philosophy more than anything.
Yeah. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. The course is titled Python Basics Exercises, Conditional Logic and Control Flow. The video course is part of the Python Basics series, which accompanies the book Python Basics, A Practical Introduction to Python 3. This course covers a set of exercises and challenges for you to practice the techniques covered in the Python Basics video course on conditional logic and control flow. Previous guest and Real Python core team member Martin Broyce is the instructor, and he'll present the exercises and challenges for you to practice, and then take you through techniques of how you could solve them. You'll practice the following: Boolean comparators like equals or not equals or greater and less than, logical operators and or and not, conditional logic of if, elif, and else, exception handling and creating try and except blocks. You'll practice loops of both types, for and while, and how to use control flow statements of break and continue. Ultimately, you'll bring all your knowledge together to build a text-based role-playing game as a challenge. And like most of the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections, And you get code examples for the techniques shown. All courses have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the search tool on realpython.com. One of the things that I thought was interesting there, that diving into the programming side of it, and you had referenced the idea of having it suggest these APIs or something that it wasn't able to generate. When you prompt it, are you prompting it, like you said, you were like, oh, I want to learn this library, practice with it. Are those the type of things that you've been doing with it? Or have you been saying, hey, help me, develop an entire API or something like that? What are the types of challenges you've presented? Then I'm wondering, what are the areas where it has difficulties?
Yeah, I'm always trying to give it as much detailed and specific information in my prompts as possible. And I'm always asking for specific detailed information. I found that, if you ask ChatGPT, like, hey, what are some popular Python packages to do such and such task? It'll come back with some things, but it's also very vague and generic, and it's sort of like, well, I could have just Googled this and found other things. And I don't know if you've ever seen those websites where you're just sort of looking up information on products, or just trying to broadly cast a net to find out, hey, what's out there. And you'll find things like, here are the best portable air conditioners of 2023.
Yeah.
And looking through them, you can tell they haven't actually done any curation or consumer report style journalism or investigation. Yeah.
I feel like those particular articles are going to be the thing that immediately get done by this type of tool.
Oh, yeah.
Which sucks, but they aren't very useful anyway. I mean, they can maybe give you somewhat of a direction to go from there, but you don't feel like trusting, especially in the way that it's written. It's like they just were keyword spamming best, whatever.
Right. Yeah, and especially at this point, I've learned oh yeah, you can't actually trust those at all, because they are literally just copying and pasting the Amazon search results page for whatever product, because they just want to add their affiliate link. They don't care at all. They're probably not even paying attention to the reviews or anything like that. Or most likely they're just copying and pasting from other articles that have done that as well.
Reformatting it slightly differently.
And unfortunately that is I think the predominant danger of AI is not that it's going to gain awareness and enslave humanity, but it's just going to make the internet so much worse by filling it with spam.
Yeah.
Essentially, this sort of content that it's grammatically correct and it looks like at first glance a human wrote it, but then you realize it's very vague, it's very generic, just text that has no information in it. And so what's going to happen is now our search engine results are going to get even worse than they are right now, because we're going to have so much AI generated content out there. And, this is going to happen with the listicles first. And then I'm also starting to see this more on YouTube with automatically generated YouTube videos that are just pulled together from stock footage and a robot voice. And, some AI speech engines are getting better and better at sounding less robotic. And I don't know, I'm on a computer 10 hours a day, and I'm looking at all of these things, and I understand how this works. And I feel that I'm pretty internet savvy. So I'm always surprised at how people get fooled by the most primitive of Photoshops.
Right.
Or, I can look at an image and see oh, that's Donald Trump in this image, but I can clearly see that the hands are messed up or something like this, or the lighting is off. So this was just copied and pasted into something else.
Right.
But then, you look under the comments and it's a lot of people saying wow, I can't believe this. This is incredible. And, of course, the whole outrage that provokes. But then again, hey, what do I know? Maybe all of those comments are also AI generated.
Yeah, that's unfortunately what I feel like right now.
Yeah. So the spam problem is really going to be the main issue with all of these large language models, is just the internet having not even wrong information, but just meaningless, garbage, useless information that just takes up your time and it makes it harder to sift through. But also fake reviews, either positive reviews for your product or negative reviews for your competitors' products, social media bots that will sort of astroturf popularity for some issue or against some issue or something like that. And this is all going to happen fairly soon. We can see that, anyone can actually, just try out OpenAI or Bard from Google or any of these large language model systems, which is why it's always peculiar to me whenever I read a lot of journalism articles on AI, I usually chatting them up and inflating the hype, because I think like, well, people can actually you can try this out right now. You can talk to ChatGPT, and it's always amazing at first because it seems so lifelike and everything.
Right.
And I suppose it's also just my training with software development and computer science in general. Like, I know the types of questions that these systems do poorly on, and you can like trick it into sort of like the multiplication problem right there. Like, I know, okay, this is text generation and it's not actually doing the math. It's just sort of generating text that is a plausible response. And that's the main thing, is these AIs are producing plausible responses. They're not producing correct responses that are factual. And that's a very key difference there.
Yeah.
Like, I would not trust an AI to do my taxes because it can't even do math correctly. But at the same time, we see all these articles saying like, oh, ChatGPT can argue a case in court, or it can get a degree from MIT. And when you, of course, this is all just clickbait because it's fascinating and everything. It's a lot of hype, and it's especially disappointing because, well, actually, there are some things that large language models are really great at as well. So it's not all hype, but most of the stuff that I've seen we're still very on in the hype cycle of it.
One of the things that I mentioned the article earlier that Martin had written about kind of using it as a tutor of sorts. Do you feel like students could use it as a way to learn more about, in this case, Python as a language? Have you thought about that at all, of like ways that it could be used to kind of help someone get through? He has some examples in his article of like, hey, let's have it create a cheat sheet for us to kind of memorize some of these topics. And some of the stuff that I really like that this can output sort of automatically is formatting stuff that can be kind of a pain in the butt, but you can actually say, hey, I want it to, have this many, this column this way and this layout, and it can actually generate this markdown, which as a human typing and, generating and creating is actually kind of a pain, but it can take those instructions and do that part really well, or doing something like generating a YAML file, or doing some of these things that are somewhat tedious those are things that I've found really useful that it can do. So now I'm kind of mixing up two topics here, but do you think it could be useful? Let's start with the student thing, learning the ins and outs of a language.
So I was talking with Chris Williams on Virtual Brown Bag, because I said like, well, yeah, maybe these AI systems would be useful for learning it. Whereas Chris just said, no, absolutely not.
Okay.
And I can kind of see his point there. Really, we're still too early to know if AI is going to be a net positive or negative for education. I mean, we can see the benefits and we can see the drawbacks. And I found myself really going more towards the no, don't use this.
Okay.
Especially the more beginner you are and the less you know about some topic, the less you should rely on AI as far as giving you facts. I think the best way I can put it is, well, 5 out of 6 people will tell you that Russian roulette is perfectly safe to play.
Right.
It's just that you can use large language models as a good teacher, and it'll give you all this information and it'll answer your questions for you. But you really are playing Russian roulette. I mean, at any point, it could give you some false, like factually incorrect bit of information, and you really have no way of knowing what it is. And so, like what I had to do when I was reviewing the feedback it gave me for my recursion book, I have to check every single little thing, because what I've noticed is these chatbots will give me mistakes that are small, and there are also mistakes that are really big.
Okay.
And you never really know what it's going to be. I mean, you were talking about sort of like it's great for formatting stuff into like YAML formats or something like that. And I've done that also when I was having it review bits of the third edition of Automate the Boring Stuff. I have a chapter on YAML and TOML and these other data serialization formats. And it told me like, oh, well, like one way that YAML and Python are similar is that they both have capital T true and capital F false as keywords. And I thought, oh, okay, that's great. And then I realized, oh, that's actually not true. YAML has lowercase t true and lowercase f false. It's just like JSON and JavaScript. And then I think it also said that like TOML had a null keyword or XML had some null keyword or something like that, which is also not true. And so, you know, these are super small. Like I didn't even recognize that it had given me bad information until I had passed my YAML text to a linter, to a validator, and then it popped up with this thing that said like, "Oh, this is actually wrong." You know,
Invalid.
yeah, it's invalid. I thought like, "Oh, wait, why did I do that?" And I realized, well, I did that because the AI told me that. And it's such a small fact. Like you would think like, how could it get such a basic thing wrong? And well, actually, no one can tell you why, because these are all
Right.
stochastic systems. It's generating text for you. And that's also sort of another really troublesome thing is you can think of like, you know, programming languages have just gotten more and more abstract and away from machine code and from assembly and that sort of thing. And Python is just a bunch more of abstractions there. And you could think of a large language model as a programming language of sorts. Your source code is the prompt that you give it, and then the output is the source code for the program that you want it to write. But if it's a programming language, it's a non-deterministic programming language, which is really scary to think about. You can give it the same prompt, and it will give you different code every time. And so that's the sort of like unreliability or inconsistency that, you know, sometimes maybe it's fine and other times, you know, it'll give you code that's obviously wrong. And then sometimes it'll give you code that is 99% right, except for this small, tiny bug in it that will go unnoticed until it's in production and running somewhere.
So one of the big fears then would be with the beginner trying to learn the language is they don't know what they don't know. And
right,
having this assumption that this thing, well, it's studied the corpus of Python and it should know what it is, and they're just going to rely on it. And this over-reliance would become a huge potential problem for them going forward if they assume that this is the proper way to do things. So I'm wondering about that then for, say, the intermediate programmer, if they're checking their code as they go along and are noticing these things. And in your case, you mentioned using a linter, which would be very helpful to kind of like go back and say, okay, is this properly, formatted code? And I mean, there's a few other things that could help with that, I guess, in there. But is that always going to be, I'm always is not a good word, I guess, but is that going to be one of the big things going forward? You have to think about like, okay, where is this more useful for me as a programmer using it?
I think it becomes less of an issue the more experience you have.
Okay.
The main thing about people learning to program in the first place, whether it's with Python or some other programming language, is that programming is very unlike other skills. It's very literal. The computer is doing exactly what you tell it to. You know, if you have a comma instead of a period or a period instead of a comma, that is going to give you some error, and the error message might be kind of inscrutable, but you have to get it exactly right. I mean,
right.
That's the great and terrible thing about computers is that they do exactly what you tell them to. And it takes a while for people to get used to this idea. And a lot of the things that we take for granted, such as, with Stack Overflow, whenever you post a question there, Stack Overflow has a huge list of sort of ways to ask a productive programming question.
Sure.
They want you to provide like the source code that can reproduce the problem. They want you to give very specific information about your computer and like what operating system or what platform you're using. Does this problem happen every time or is it intermittent? All of this other information. And it's generally the culture that you should provide all of this information up front. You should have already Googled to try to figure things out for yourself. And you should tell people what the original problem is and what you're trying to do and what you've already tried and all of this stuff. But when people are first learning how to program, we're still sort of in that school classroom mindset of, oh, the teacher will tell us all of these things. If we have a question, we can just immediately ask them. And that's usually how we're used to learning. Whereas learning to program, especially now in the internet age, it's kind of a mindset shift. So if you're coming into contact with this system that seems to be responding to you like a human, you're probably going to be giving it questions that are very vague, which is what you don't want to do with an AI, because it's going to give you vague answers in return, and it's not going to be all that useful, and you'll end up spending so much time sort of reading through a bunch of generic text that doesn't have any actionable information on it. I mean, I still get readers who will then email me and they'll just say like, hey, my program doesn't work. And that's the entire email. And then I have to go back to them. It's like, hey, okay, can you provide me the source code?
Right.
Make sure that the indentation didn't get messed up when you were like copying and pasting it. At this point now, I've written up all of this information into a blog post, and I kind of just send them a link to the blog post because, if you don't follow all of these steps, the whole process of learning just takes 10 times as long.
Yeah.
And then, but the other part of that is, when we're first learning to program, we'll think of an AI's word as like, well, why would the AI say this if it wasn't true? Because we tend to think of these AIs as being like people and they have human-like intelligence. This is probably something that a lot of people have heard of. The New York lawyers in I think the Southern District of New York, who had ChatGPT write up a legal brief for them.
Right.
And and ChatGPT cited all of these other legal cases that it had just made up. I mean, they sounded very realistic. It was a lawsuit involving airlines. And so ChatGPT had said like, oh, well, so-and-so versus Delta Incorporated and blah, 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 and all these other cases involving airline companies. And then it was found out that like none of these cases actually existed, which has severe consequences as a legal document that you've submitted to the court. It's now like you're lying to the court.
Yeah.
And it was
pretty big over-reliance there.
Yeah. I read some of the transcripts of the judge just raking this lawyer over the coals, and it's really hard to read. But the thing is, like, we don't know if this is the first time a lawyer has tried to use a large language model to write a legal paper, or if it's just the first time a lawyer has been caught doing this.
Right.
So
who's doing the checking? Yeah.
But yeah, and when you read what this lawyer was saying about why they did this, is the lawyer is already used to using all of these online legal databases.
Sure.
And like, oh, just looking at cases and everything like that. So he just assumed, oh yeah, ChatGPT is doing the same thing. It's consulting.
It's like LexisNexis or whatever.
Right.
These other, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, these bogus cases, it's not like somebody intentionally put fake data into a legal database somewhere. It's just that ChatGPT generates plausible responses to your prompts. It's just generating things that sound correct, basically. It's not actually consulting online databases or anything. It doesn't even know why it knows David Bowie's birthday.
Right.
And so it is this sort of this wild assumption that they made. And really we can't blame them, because according to all the media surrounding these AI systems, we're saying that they're Skynet and they're super intelligent and they're going to take all our jobs away and that sort of thing. For beginners who want to learn how to program, I kind of say, I don't know, if you remind yourself every single time you submit something to one of these large language models that the information it's giving you, you have to check every single little bit of what it says to make sure, like, oh, is this actually true? And try running the code yourself and seeing if it works or not. You then yeah, okay, sure, you can do that. And just remember to be very specific in what you're asking for, and also asking for very specific answers. It's when you ask it for like, hey, what do you think about some topic in programming or something like this? 9 times out of 10 or 85% of the time, it won't give you something that's completely wrong if we go by the numbers for that book review that I had it do.
Right.
But it's not guaranteed at all. These systems are not infallible by any means.
Yeah. One of the things that I think was the biggest concerns I'd heard, this is really early on, probably a year ago or whatever, when these things were just starting to really take off and people were thinking about, or even, I guess earlier than that, people were using Copilot, which maybe we could talk about briefly, but kind of comes at a different angle, like in the sense that it's helping you sort of complete your code. And I feel like some of the tricks that are in there is that it's not hard for it to add sort of weird mistakes that are inside, a program. Like if you're thinking about writing a script, that's one type of thing. But if you're putting a system together, a full application and so forth, it's possible that it could be inserting security bugs or other kinds of things. And you're still going to need to be doing all of your due diligence
Right.
on top of it. And I wonder sometimes where are you getting the additional benefits of that? I mean, I've had, this is a long time ago, but I was, I think, using Pylance or something like that. And it had made some suggestions to me while I'm creating something in VS Code. And it suggested this particular part of another framework. And I'm like, oh, no, I don't really want that. But at the same time, it had already added an import statement for me.
Oh.
that was going to use that. And I'm like, so, that's in a whole other part of the code, right? You're not looking at that part.
Yeah.
And so then I had to go back and look. I'm like, why am I importing that? And did I type that? Kind of thing. And so like, I wonder if those are the kinds of things that potentially are other, sort of pitfalls in this, that as your program gets larger and you look at, using some of these things, if that's going to be, where potential other problems are at, like security and sort of odd bugs. I guess, what are ways to combat that are the other kind of questions I think about too, like, outside of, well, just don't use it.
Yeah, what I've found that a lot of these systems, as far as generating code, they're really great at generating small amounts of code. So just like an individual function. I mean, you can think of it as like an autocomplete with Stack Overflow. Like we all make jokes, but this is also very true of just copying and pasting code from Stack Overflow.
Sure.
And so you can think of these as doing basically that, except automatically. And it has all the same problems, where on the one hand, it's great because now you have this code, but on the other hand, you need to make sure you actually understand what it is you're copying and pasting. It's not enough to just sort of hit compile and then run it and say, yeah, it looks like it works. So these are tools that are nice for experienced software developers because they turn code writing tasks into code review tasks, which can give you a bit of a productivity boost right there. I mean, a lot of the code that we write on a day-to-day basis is more or less the same code that a million other programmers have written before. And that's why these AI systems are able to just sort of fill in the blanks, because like, okay, yeah, how many times does it seem merge sort or something like that? So it can just give you that information. But I've found that generally whenever I ask it to, my experiences with ChatGPT, whenever I ask it to write a significant piece of code, like say several pages, or maybe even an entire application, even a small application.
Okay.
I found that if I run that code and it has some problem, I'll usually go back to ChatGPT and ask it to fix these problems. I'll give it the error message. I'll just copy and paste that into the next prompt and ask it to fix it. And it'll say, oh, I'm sorry. And then it'll give me some more source code. Personally, I have a sort of 2 strikes you're out rule when it comes to this. And because if I get that fixed code and I find that it just has another problem, that really tells me like, okay, I will go ahead and ask it for a few more rounds to fix this. But most of the time, if it hasn't fixed it by the second time, it's just going to keep giving me incorrect code or buggy code or like
Okay.
code that has other made up function calls to functions that don't exist. I mean, the thing is, the LLM is very patient. It will always answer your questions and it will always provide answers because that's basically what it does. It generates text.
Right.
So, it's eventually you're going to find like after the fourth or fifth round of getting problematic code that doesn't actually do what it says it's going to do, you can figure out, okay, it's just never going to give me the correct answer for this particular problem.
I like to think about like maybe we could dig into like some of the stuff that we would say, okay, it's really good at doing this. I mentioned, like the formatting stuff that I thought that was something it's really good at. I don't have experience with this personally, but let's say you got that library you were looking at and maybe its documentation was kind of mixed, and not that you want to do their documentation job, but could you have it like explain this code to me or potentially write a doc string for you or potentially add a test or are those things that you find it's good at?
Yeah, actually that is something I do like these systems for, is just generating doc strings and also generating comments within the code as well.
Okay.
Again, it is that sort of thing where you have to closely review everything it says because the last thing you want to do is throw in wrong information. But it's like even as an author, writing prose and describing things, like it's really hard for me because I don't want to be generic and vague, but I also want to, very succinctly add a comment here that explains all of this stuff. And that's kind of a pain. And with ChatGPT, I find that mostly I don't use the documentation it gives me, but that's a great starting point to reword and change around the comments and doc strings that it gives me. So it is a bit of a productivity boost, but I've just never been able to get any of these AIs to generate an entire application for me. It's other than like something, anything more than like 100 or 200 lines of code, it just kind of falls apart at some point. So the idea that as a non-programmer, you could just say like, I want to create a tech startup, I'll just have ChatGPT write my application for me. Again, it really works better if you can be very specific. But, if you get really specific, you're writing literal code.
Right.
You can't just say like, hey, ChatGPT, generate a social media website that's really cool and will go viral. You're not going to get any sort of meaningful reply from that. Or if you ask a person to do that as well.
Right. Yeah, it's like I have 700 additional questions for you.
Right. So, yeah. It's like, no, I'm just the big vision person. You deal with the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, so it's kind of a problem. Yes, that's what I've heard is like, some of the things it's good at is looking more at bite-sized things, looking at a particular function, helping you maybe write a doc string on it and, describing some of that stuff or maybe potentially explaining a piece of code to you. It might be able to do some of those kinds of things. But yeah, I think the larger it gets, the more, and like you said, even as a human, it helps us to break things down into smaller things.
Right.
Are there any other things you want to just kind of, like we're kind of at an hour here, that we could mention? I think it's fascinating that it did kind of an interesting technical review of your book. I think that's kind of cool that it could be, something useful in that if, maybe you write blog posts or you do some other kinds of things, you might want to have somebody, you don't have access to a technical reviewer, but you as the person do need to know
right,
the subject. You still need to be the subject matter expert. So
yeah, it can't really give you any ideas, but it can just sort of like vaguely point out like, oh, this looks like it might be wrong. And, 15% of the time, it is pointing out something incorrect. But, having it come up with original ideas or just original ways of writing things. A lot of the content it produces sounds very generic.
Yeah.
But, if generic stuff is all you need, then yeah, it's great for doing stuff like that. But I don't know. I think the last thing that I would want to say about LLMs, and this sounds really silly, but I do feel like it needs to be said. These AI systems are not conscious. They're not like sentient.
Oh, yeah.
They don't have a personality. A lot of that is that they are written so that they provide text in a first person tone of voice and they sound like a person, but that's...
I mean, they add the word chat to it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the whole premise of the platform.
Yeah. I mean, that whole thing goes back to like the Eliza chatbot from the 1960s.
Right. Yeah.
For people who don't know, this was a bit of software written that was supposed to be a chatbot that imitated what was a Carl Rogers,
like a psychotherapist kind of thing.
Psychotherapist,
or something? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it would basically just do this by sort of repeating things back to you, or it would be a very good listener in that it wouldn't say all
Tell
that
me
much.
more about that.
Yeah, and you could say like, "I feel very sad," and it would then reply, "Why do you feel very sad?"
Exactly.
And it just changes around the wording a bit, but it's mostly you're just like, talking to a handprint on a volleyball or something like that. But like at the same time, even this really primitive system actually did fool a bunch of people into thinking like, oh yeah, I'm in a chat room with an actual human psychiatrist,
right?
And they would insist like, oh yeah, no, this is a real thing. But like, yeah, so Eliza, it's easy to laugh about this, but we're kind of doing the same thing today with a lot of these chatbots, is thinking like, oh, these are actually alive. They have needs and wants like people do. And no, it's just software.
Yeah.
I mean, but like at the same time, you really can't blame people for that, because so much of our technology today is kind of mind blowing. Like,
yeah, the voice stuff is blowing my mind right now. Like, it's literally frightening me in some ways. Of like, as a podcaster.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and like my phone talks to satellites in outer space, and I can find where I am anywhere on the Earth. Like that's kind of amazing if you...
Yeah, there's some crazy stuff, yeah.
Yeah, if you stop and think about it. So you can't really blame people for thinking AI is also this similar leap in technology.
Yeah. We don't have time to dive into a whole ethical thing, but we touched on it a little bit here and there. I'll leave this poster that I found just the other day that I thought was really kind of good, that I think is a good thing if you want to dig into a little bit of the ethics. It hits on a lot of them. It's titled If a Hammer Was Like AI. And it's just a tool is the thing that they always put on there, and the just is doing a lot of work there. So I agree with that. There's a few of those that I feel like probably the one that hits the hardest for me as a hammer is the accountability projection. If the hammer breaks and hurts someone, the manufacturer will claim the hammer has a mind of its own and they can't help you. And I'm like, ugh.
Oh,
that's the kind of stuff that worries me a little bit about this stuff. So, and how it might be deployed. So, but
thankfully, we'll never do anything like, put this AI in a car or something like that.
Oh yeah, no, we wouldn't do that. Yeah. I have these weekly questions I like to ask everybody, and what's something that you're excited about in the world of Python?
Okay, so I found out about this several months ago, but I'm still really excited about it. It is a tool called Ruff, R-U-F-F, that is a linter and a code formatter for Python that is written in Rust, and it is amazing. I started writing this blog post where I wanted to look at all of these static code analysis tools, because there's so many out there. There's like PyLint and AutoPep, and they have like really similar names. There's PyFlakes and Flake8 and all of this different stuff. And so I thought like, okay, I want to just like gather all of these, look at each one of them, compare and contrast, write up a blog post. But then later I found this one tool called Ruff that had come out pretty recently. I think it was 2022, last year, when it had come out. And it's very quickly eating the lunch of all of these other tools. It is something like 10 or 20 times faster than a lot of the other tools. And that's kind of a game changer, because it's one thing to have, a static code tool. You can run it and it'll give you a report after 30 seconds of looking through your code base. But, if this comes back in 1 second, well, that's a tool that you can have it running constantly in the background to give you all of this, pointing out all of these like tiny little code issues. And also it just does so much. I think there's one page on the Ruff website that points out all of the different tools that it replaces. So it's things like PyLint and all these Flake plugins. as well. All of these like import statement analyzers and
Right.
so many things. And it's really incredible. So that's the rough tool. I think really now I think I can get all of my tools down to just running black and running rough. And then I don't know, maybe like a package analyzer, something that looks at my setup.py file. But I'm pretty sure somebody will write a plugin for Rough that'll do that eventually too. So it's really great. I gave my talk at PyCon 2023 this year on the topic of Rough. Um, it basically was just me talking about all of these different static code analysis tools, and the talk itself is up on YouTube along with all of PyCon's talks. But at the end of it, I say, yeah, forget everything I said. Just use Rough. That's basically replacing all of these. It's really amazing.
Yeah, I think we had talked about your article on the show back when it came out, and so I'll definitely include the link to the talk. I didn't get a chance to see it. Yeah, I keep hearing about this tool, and I know a handful of people that are definitely using it all the time now. What's something that you want to learn next? This doesn't have to be Python.
Oh, okay. So I know I've been saying this for probably 3 or 4 years now. I really want to learn Rust.
Okay.
Part of it is like just learning about this tool Rough, and it's like, oh, it was written in Rust, so it can compile. It's an actual compilable language, just like C++ or something like that, and it becomes really fast. But it has all of these other language constructs for code safety and things like that. And it's, I've just been busy with so many other projects and things, but Rust is still on the list of things that I want to learn. It's kind of funny, like when I was younger, I kept learning different programming languages, and I dabbled with like Visual Basic and Java and C++ and Perl and PHP.
Yeah.
And then I think around the mid 2000s, I learned Python, and I kind of just stopped learning new programming languages after Python because Python was so great.
Sure.
But I think Rust might be what draws me into taking a look at some new languages again.
Any books or resources you found that you're going to use in that process?
Yes. I forget the exact title. It's something like Command Line Tools in Rust.
Okay. I'll look it up and I'll include a link.
Yeah, it's a pretty good book. It basically goes into like, hey, let's start creating a bunch of these really simple like Linux command line tools,
Yeah.
like the ls command and other things like that. And let's just write a version of them in Rust, just so that they're all text-based and it's fairly simple, but we end up with useful little projects at the end of it.
That seems like the common like target that a lot of people have too, is like they want a fast tool, and they kind of maybe have a small like thing that they want to program, and that's kind of a neat way to learn it. That's how I often see Rust being used. Not so much as it's going to be an application that's out there running. It's usually infrastructural type of tools underlying things, but I don't know if that's for sure. At least those are the Python people I talk to that are using Rust. So
Right.
yeah, cool. You mentioned a couple of your books on here already. I was thinking of another one. You have a Python programming exercises gently explained.
Yes.
That's a recent one.
Yeah, that's a book I think came out earlier this year. I kept looking at these coding problem websites, Top Coder and Leet Code, and there's a whole bunch of them out there. And
Yeah.
they all kind of have that similar, like very computer science sophomore sort of level of data structure and algorithms kind of questions that they ask. And I thought like, well, what a lot of beginners really need are just a lot simpler and easier than that, and with a lot more hand holding. So this is Python programming exercises gently explained. It has 42 different problems. The first one is Hello World, and they get a little bit harder. The last one is just bubble sort.
Okay.
So that's sort of the cap on the complexity. For each of these problems, I describe the problem, give a bunch of assert statements to run to check if your solution is correct.
Okay.
And then if you still need help, I have sections that you can read on that will explain some more like common gotchas with the solution and other things. And if you still need more help after that, there's an actual solution that has some parts of the code taken out. So it's more of a fill in the blank thing. So if you're the person who has been learning to program and you get this sort of blank editor fear response, where you like don't even know how to start, then this hopefully provides more of a gentler way to tackle these problems and hopefully build up your confidence and knowledge.
Cool. How can people follow what you do online?
Probably the best way to find me is inventwithpython.com. That's the website where I put all of my books.
Okay.
And then I just have a link to all of my social media accounts from there. So I'm usually just at Al Sweigart on all the different websites, but also at the same time, my last name is kind of hard to spell correctly the first time through. So it's probably just easier to go to inventwithpython.com.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Al, thanks again for coming on the show. It's always fun to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
I want to thank Al Sweigart for coming on the show again this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.